It's doing it again. Hi, everybody. This is Allison from Alley Cat Creations. How are you? Please like, share, and subscribe to my channel if you have yet to do so. And if you get anything from my work, you connect on Epiphany and Mind Explosion. A new book to read. Even though this is not new. Might be new to you. A new author to explore, artwork to create. Please support me. All the links are at the bottom of the description of this video. Allycatcreations211.com is where you can see all the artwork that I create and make and privately sell. So if you're interested in any of it, please email me. That also is in the description or on the website, where if you see something you like, it might be available for purchase. Go look. And that's without saying I do a lot of pyramids. Of a lot of different types of pyramids. I also do commissions. So if you want something specific to you, let me know. 3D memberships is a really great way and a fantastic way to keep this channel going. It's only one tier. I only have one tier. But with that membership, you get free entries into raffles. I'm happy to report that I think 2 people told me they got their raffle entry stuff today. I sent it out on Monday. Um, I give away, I do raffles, and channel member only gets a free entry. So if you're a channel member, you get a free entry. And you get oracle readings by me once a week. So that's just for the collective, not personal. But it's a small group of members, so they get pretty much really specific information on how to better their lives through the cards as I channel spirit. So these are really good ways to support me. As you saw today, we're doing the Urantia book. This is a long section, and I'm tired. I got my coffee here. I feel like I did a dance extensive from the Royal Ballet. Probably other dance institutes. My body hurts. I was supposed to mow my lawn, didn't get to. And they still have to figure out how to get my lawnmower exchanged. Fun times. But today is paper 94, the Melchizedek teachings in the Orient. This shall be interesting. The early teachers of the Salem religion penetrated to the remotest tribes of Africa and Eurasia, ever preaching Machiaventa's gospel of man's faith and trust in the one universal God as the only price of obtaining divine favor. Melchizedek's covenant with Abraham was the pattern for all the early propaganda that went out from Salem and other centers. Urantia has never had more enthusiastic and aggressive missionaries of any religion than these noble men and women who carry the teachings of Melchizedek over the entire Eastern Hemisphere. These missionaries are recruited from many peoples and races, and they largely spread their teachings through the medium of native converts. They established training centers in different parts of the world where they taught the natives the Salem religion and then commissioned these pupils to function as teachers among their own people. The Salem teachings in the Vedic India. We'll see how this goes. In the days of Melchizedek, India was a cosmopolitan country which had recently come under the political and religious dominance of Aryan Andite invaders from the north and west. At this time, only the northern and western portions of the peninsula had extensively permeated by the Aryans. These Vedic newcomers had brought along with them many tribal deities. Their religious forms of worship followed closely the ceremonial practices of the earlier Andite forebears, in that the father still functioned as a priest and the mother as a priestess, and the family hearth was still utilized as an altar. The Vedic cult was then in process of growing and metamorphosis under the direction of the Brahmin caste of teacher priests, who are gradually assuming control over the expanding ritual of worship. The amalgamation of the one-time 33 Aryan deities was well under the way when the Salem missionaries penetrated the north of India. Sorry, my camera's bothering me, my own self. Back and forth, back and forth. Crazy. The polytheism of these Aryans represented a degeneration of their earlier monotheism, occasioned with their separation into tribal units, each tribe having a venerated god. This devotion of original monotheism and Trinitarianism of Andite Mesopotamia was in process of resynthesis in the early centuries of the second millennium before Christ. The many gods were organized into a pantheon under the triune leadership of the Deus Pitra, the Lord of Heaven, Indra, the temptress Lord of the atmosphere, and Agni, the three-headed fire god, Lord of the earth, and the vestigial symbol of earlier Trinity concept. Definite henotheistic developments were paving the way for the evolved monotheism. Agni, the most ancient deity, was often exalted as the father head of the entire pantheon. The deity father principle, sometimes called Prachi. You all know from, if you listen to my Blavatsky, I cannot pronounce these names. So let's just give me some grace. Sometimes termed Brahma, was submerged in the theologic battle with the Brahmin priests, later fought with the Salem teachers. The Brahmin was conceived as the energy divinity principle activating the entire Vedic pantheon. The Salem missionaries preached the one God of Melchizedek, the Most High of Heaven. This portrayal was not altogether disharmonious with the emerging concept of the Father Brahma as the source of all gods, but the Salem doctrine was non-ritualistic and hence ran directly counter to the dogmas, traditions, and teachings of the Brahmin priesthood. Never would the Brahmin priests accept the Salem teaching of salvation through faith, favor with God, apart from ritualistic observances and sacrificial ceremonies. The rejection of the Melchizedek gospel of trust in God and salvation through faith marked a vital turning point for India. The Salem missionaries had contributed much to the loss of faith in all the ancient Vedic gods, but the leaders, the priests of Vedism, refused to accept the Melchizedek teachings of the one and one simple faith. The Brahmins culled the sacred writings of their day in an effort to combat the Salem teachers, and this compilation, as later revised, has come down to modern times as the Rig Veda, one of the most ancient of sacred texts. The second, third, and fourth Vedas followed as the Brahmins sought to crystallize, formalize, and fix their rituals of worship and sacrifice upon the peoples of those days. Taken at their best, these writings are as equal of any other body of similar character and beauty of concept and truth of discernment. But as this superior religion became contaminated with the thousands upon thousands of superstitions, cults, and rituals of southern India, it progressively metamorphosized into the most venerated system of theology ever developed by mortal man. An examination of the Vedas will disclose some of the highest and some of the most debased concepts of deity ever be conceived. As perspective. And just a pause here. It is known that the blue avians or the Arcturians might have been the ones that seeded India, and these deities that people, unbeknownst to them, were getting high density beings that taught them, came in their little flying spaceships. This is a group of Urtites that wrote and channeled this book. And like I said, when you read something and you see the program and the narrative, you can see that they're not happy with their brothers in the sky. It's just a perspective, mind you, but I'm giving you mine. Now, I don't necessarily agree with Brahmanism, but there's some things to it that you can't escape. Brahmanism. As the Salem missionaries penetrated southward into the Dravidian Deccan, they encountered an increasing caste system, the scheme of the Aryans to prevent loss of racial identity in the face of a rising tide of the secondary Singic peoples. Since the Brahmin priest caste was the very essence of the system, the social order greatly retarded the progress of the Salem teachers. This caste system failed to save the Aryan race, but it did succeed in perpetuating the Brahmins, who in turn have maintained their religious hegemony in India to the present time. And now, with the weakening of Vedism, through the rejection of higher truth, the cult of the Aryans became subject to increasing inroads from the Deccan. In a desperate effort to stem the tide of racial extinction and religious obliteration, the Brahmin caste sought to exalt themselves above all else. They taught that the sacrifice to deity in itself was all efficacious, that it was all compelling in its potency. They proclaimed that of the two essential divine principles of the universe, one was Brahman, the deity, and the other was the Brahmin priesthood. Among no other Urantia peoples did this priest presume to exalt themselves above even their gods, to regulate to themselves the honors due their gods. But they went so absurdly far with these presumptuous claims that the whole precarious system collapsed before the debasing cults, which poured in from the surrounding and less advanced civilizations. The vast Vedic priesthood itself floundered and sank beneath the black flood of inertia and pessimism, which their own selfish and unwise presumption had brought upon all India. The undue concentration on self led certainly to a fear of non-revolutionary perpetuation of self in an endless round of successive incarnations as man, beast, or weeds, and of all the contaminating beliefs which could have become fastened upon what may have been an emerging monotheism. None was so stupefying as the belief in transmitigation of the doctrine of the reincarnation of souls, which came from the Dravidian Deccan. The belief in the weary and monotonous round of repeated, sorry, my brain's off. Transmitigations rob struggling mortals of their long-cherished hope of finding that deliverance and spiritual advancement in death, which had been a part of the earlier Vedic faith. This philosophically debilitating teaching was followed by the invention of the doctrine of eternal escape from self by submergence in the universal breast and peace of absolute union with Brahman, the oversoul of all creation. Mortal desire and human ambition were effectively ravished and virtually destroyed. For more than 2,000 years, the better minds of India have sought to escape from all desire, and thus was opened wide the door for the entrance of those latter cults and teachings, which has virtually shackled the souls of many Hindu peoples in the chains of spiritual hopelessness. Of all civilizations, the Vedic Aryan paid the most terrible price for its rejection of the Salem gospel. Caste alone could not perpetuate the Aryan religio-cultural system, and as the inferior religions of the Deccan permeated the north, there developed an age of despair and hopelessness. It was during these dark days that the cult of taking no life arose, and it has ever since persisted. Many of the new cults were frankly atheistic, claiming that such salvation was attainable could come only by man's own unaided efforts. But throughout a great deal of this unfortunate philosophy, distorted remnants of the Melchizedek and even the animic teachings can be traced. This camera is driving me batshit. There were the times of a compilation of the latter scriptures of the Hindu faith, the Brahmins, and the Upanishads. Having rejected the teachings of personal religion through the personal faith experience with the one God, and having become contaminated with the flood of debasing and debilitating cults and creeds from the Deccan. With their anthropomorphism and reincarnations, the Brahmic priesthood experienced a violent reaction against these vitalizing beliefs. There was a definite effort to seek and to find true reality. The Brahmins set out to de-anthropomorphize the Indian concept of deity, but in so doing, they stumbled into the grievous error of depersonalizing the concept of God, and they emerged not with a lofty and spiritual ideal of the Paradise Father, but with a distant and metaphysical idea of an all-encompassing absolute. In their efforts at self-preservation, the Brahmins had rejected the one God of Melchizedek, and now they found themselves with the hypothesis a Brahman, that indefinite and elusive philosophic self, that impersonal and impotent it, which has left the spiritual life of India hopeless and prostrate from the unfortunate day to the 20th century. Sorry, guys, my brain and my teeth are not in compliance. It was during the times of the writing in the Upanishads, the Buddhism arose in India. But despite its excessive of 1,000 years, it could not compete with later Hinduism. Despite a higher morality, its early portrayal of God was even less well-defined than was that of Hinduism, which provided for lesser and personal deities. Buddhism finally gave way in northern India before the onslaught of a militant Islam, with its clear-cut concept of Allah as the supreme God of the universe. Brahmanic, I don't know how to say that properly, philosophy, because it sounds different in my head. Like I said, I'm not here. Brain's not here. While the highest phase of Brahmanism was hardly a religion, it was truly one of the most noble reaches of mortal mind into the domains of philosophy and metaphysics. Having started out to discover final reality, the Indian mind did not stop until it had speculated about almost every phase of theology, accepting the essential dual concept of religion, the existence of the universal Father of all universe creatures, and the fact of the ascending experience in the universe of these very creatures as they seek to obtain the eternal Father, who has commanded them to be perfect even as he is perfect. Sorry, I'm going to have to pause. I lit some sage in hopes that whatever is bouncing my insanity off kind of calms down. Let's see. In the concept of Brahman, the minds of those days truly grasp at the idea of some all-pervading absolute, for this postulate was at one of the same time identified as creative energy and cosmic reaction. Brahman was conceived to be beyond all definitions, capable of being comprehended only by the successive negation of all finite qualities. It was definitely a belief in an absolute, even an infinite being, but this concept was largely devoid of personality, attributes, and was therefore not experienceable by individual religionists. Brahma Narayana, sorry if I'm butchering that, was conceived as the absolute, the infinite it is, the primordial creative potency of the potential cosmos, the universal self-existing static, and dial creative potency and of the potential cosmos. Had the philosophers of those days been able to make the next advance in deity conception, had they been able to conceive of the Brahman as associative and creative as the personality approachable by creative and evolving beings, then might such a teaching have become the most advanced portraiture of deity on Urantia, since it would have encompassed the first 5 levels of total deity function. It might possibly have envisioned this remaining 2. In certain phases, the concept of the one universal oversoul as the totality of the summation of all creature existence led the Indian philosophers very close to the truth of the Supreme Being. But this truth availed them not, because they failed to evolve any reasonable or rational personal approach to the attainment of their theoretic monotheistic goal of Brahman, Narayana. I got it right this time. The karma principle of causality, continuity, is again very close to the truth of the repercussional synthesis of all time-space actions in the deity presence of the Supreme. But this postulate never provided for the coordinate personal attainment of deity by the individual religionist, only for the ultimate engulfment of all personality by the universal oversoul. The philosophy of Brahmanism also came very near to the realization of the indwelling of the thought adjusters, only to become perverted through the misconception of, truth. The teaching that the soul is the indwelling of the Brahman would have paved the way for an advanced religion had not this concept been completely vitiated by the belief that there is no human individuality apart from the indwelling of the universal one. In the doctrine of the merging of self-soul with the oversoul, the theologians of India failed to provide for the survival of something human, something new and unique, something born of the union of the will of man and the will of God. The teaching of the soul's return to the Brahman is closely parallel to the truth of the adjuster's return to the bosom of the universal Father. But there is something distant from the adjuster, which also survives, the morantial counterpart of the mortal personality. And this vital concept was fatally absent from the Brahmic philosophy. Brahmic philosophy has approximated many of the facts of the universe and has approached numerous cosmic truths, but it has all too often victim to the error of failing to differentiate between the several levels of reality, such as absolute, transcendental, and finite. It has failed to take into account that what may be finite illusory on the absolute level may be absolutely real on the finite level. And it has also taken no cognizance of the essential personality of the universal Father, who is personally contractible on all levels, from the evolutionary creature's limited experience with God on up to the limitless experience of the eternal Son and the Paradise Father, the Hindu religion. With the passing of the centuries in India, the populace returned in measure to the ancient rituals of the Vedas, as they had been modified by the teachings of the Melchizedek missionaries and crystallized by the later Brahmin priesthood. This, the oldest and most cosmopolitan of the world's religion, has undergone further changes in response to Buddhism and Jainism, and to the later appearing influences of Mohammedanism and Christianity. But by the time the teachings of Jesus arrived, they had already become an occidentalized as to be a white man's religion, and strange and foreign to the Hindu mind. Hindu theology at present depicts 4 descending levels of deity and divinity. The Brahman, the absolute infinite one that it is. The Trimurti, the supreme trinity of Hinduism. In this association, Brahma, the first member, is conceived as being self-created out of the Brahman infinity, were it not for close identification with the pantheistic infinite one. Brahma could constitute the foundation for any concept of the universal Father. Brahma is also identified with fate. The worship of the second and third members, Shiva and Vishnu, arose in the first millennium after Christ. Siva is Lord of life and death, God of fertility, and master of destruction. Vishnu is extremely popular due to the belief that he periodically incarnates in human form. In this way, Vishnu becomes real and living on the imaginations of the Indians. Siva and Vishnu are each regarded by some as supreme over all. Vedic and post-Vedic deities, many of the ancient gods of the Aryans, such as Agni, Indra, and Soma, have persisted as secondary to the three members of the Trimurti. Numerous additional gods have arisen since the early days of Vedic India, and these have also been incorporated into Hindu pantheon. The demigods, Superman and semi-gods, heroes, demons, ghosts, evil spirits, sprites, monsters, goblins, saints, and later-day cults. While Hinduism has long failed to vivify the Indian people, at the same time, it has usually been a tolerant religion. Its great strength lies in the fact that it has proved to be the most adaptive, amorphic religion to appear on Urantia. It is capable of almost unlimited change and possesses an unusual range of flexible adjustment, from the high and semi-monotheistic speculations of the intellectual Brahmin to the ardent fetishism and primitive cult practices of the debased and depressed classes of ignorant believers. Hinduism has survived because it is essentially an integral part of the basic social fabric of India. It has no great hierarchy which can be disturbed or destroyed. It is interwoven into the life pattern of the people. It has adaptability to changing conditions that expels all other cults and is displaying a tolerant attitude of adoption towards many other religions. Gautama, Buddha, and even Christ himself being claimed as incarnations of Vishnu. Today in India, the great need for the portrayal of a Jesus-onian gospel, the fatherhood of God, and the sonship and consequent brotherhood of all men, which is personally realized in loving ministry and social service. In India, the philosophical framework is existent, the cult structure is present. All that is needed is the vitalizing spark of the dynamic love portrayed in the original gospel of the Son of Man, divested of the occidental dogmas and doctrines which have tended to make Michael's first life bestowal a white man's religion. Wow, my brain's off. The struggle for truth in China. As the Salem missionaries passed through Asia, spreading the doctrine of the Most High God and salvation through faith, they absorbed much of the philosophy and religious thought of the various countries traversed. But the teachers commissioned by Melchizedek and his successors did not default in their trust. They did penetrate to all peoples of the Eurasian continent, and it was in the middle of the second millennium before Christ that they arrived in China. At Sifush, for more than 100 years, the Selenites maintained their headquarters. They're training Chinese teachers who taught throughout all the dominions of the yellow race. It was in direct consequence of these teachings that the earliest form of Taoism arose in China, a vastly different religion than the one which bears the name today. Early or proto-Taoism was a compound of the following factors: the lingering teachings of Single Langton, which persisted in the concept of Shang-Ti, the god of heaven, in the times of Singlangton, however you pronounce that, it's going to drive me nuts, like a waspy. The Chinese people became virtually monotheistic. They concentrated their worship on the one truth, later known as the spirit of heaven, the universe ruler, and the yellow race never fully lost this early concept of deity, although in subsequent centuries, many subordinate gods and spirits insidiously crept into their religions. The Salem religion of the Most High Creator deity, who would bestow his favor upon mankind in response to man's faith. But it is all too true that by the time that Melchizedek missionaries had penetrated to the lands of the yellow race, their original message had become considerably changed from the simple doctrines of Salem in the days of Machiavelli. The Brahman absolute concept of Indian philosophers, coupled with the desire to escape all evil, perhaps the greatest extraneous influence in the eastward spread of the Salem religion, was exerted by the Indian teachers of the Vedic faith, who injected their conception of the Brahman, the absolute, into the Salvinistic, I can't with these fucking names, sorry, thought of the Selmites. My brain. This composite belief spread through the lands of the yellow and brown races as an underlying influence in the religio-philosophic thought. In Japan, this proto-Taoism was known as Shinto. And in this country, far distant from Salem of Palestine, the people learned of the incarnation of Melchizedek, who dwelt upon earth, that the name of God might not be forgotten by mankind. In China, all of these beliefs were later confused and compounded with the ever-growing cult ancestral worship. But never since the time of Xing Langton have the Chinese fallen into helpless slavery to priestcraft. The yellow race was the first to emerge from the barbaric bondage into orderly civilization because it was the first to achieve some measure of freedom from the abject fear of the gods, not even fearing the ghosts of the dead as other races feared them. China met her defeat because she failed to progress beyond her early emancipation from priests. She fell into an almost equally calamitous era, the worship of ancestors. But the Salemites did not labor in vain. It was upon the foundation of their gospel that the great philosophers of 6th century China built their teachings. The moral atmosphere and the spiritual sentiments of the time of Lai Ti and Confucius grew up out of the teachings of Salem missionaries of the earlier age. Lai Ti's and Confucius. I don't know. It's not Lai Tao. About 600 years before the arrival of Michael, it seemed to Melchizedek, long since departed from the flesh, that the purity of his teachings on earth was being unduly jeopardized by general absorption into older Urantia beliefs. It appeared for a time that his mission as a forerunner of Michael might be in danger of failing. And in the 6th century before Christ, through an unusual coordination of spiritual agencies, not all of which are understood even by the planetary supervisors, Urantia witnessed a most unusual presentation of manifold religious truth. Through the agency of several human teachers, the Salem Gospel was restated and revitalized, and as it was then presented, much has persisted to the times of this writing. This unique century of spiritual progress was characterized by great religious, moral, and philosophic teachers all over the civilized world. In China, the two outstanding teachers were Lai Ti and Confucius. Lai Ti built directly upon the concepts of Salem traditions when he declared Tao to the one first cause. See, there's my brain. Of all creation. Lao was a man of great spiritual vision. He taught that man's eternal destiny was everlasting union with Tao, supreme God and universal king. His comprehension of ultimate causation was most discerning, for he wrote, "Unity arises out of the absolute Tao, and from unity there appears cosmic duality, and from such duality Trinity springs forth into existence. And Trinity is the primal source of all reality. All reality is ever imbalanced between the potentials and the actuals of the cosmos, and these eternally harmonized by the spirit of divinity." Lai Tao also made one of the earliest presentations of the doctrine of returning good from evil. Goodness begets goodness, but to the one who is truly good, evil also begets goodness. He taught the return of creature to the creator and picture life as the emergence of personality from the cosmic potentials. While death was like the returning home of this creature personality, his concept of true faith was unusual, and he too likened it to the attitude of a little child. His understanding of the eternal purpose of God was clear, for he said, the absolute deity does not strive, but is always victorious. He does not coerce mankind, but always stands ready to respond to their true desires. The will of God is eternal in patience and eternal in the inevitability of its expression. And of the true religionists, he said, in expressing the truth, that it is more blessed to give than to receive. The good man seeks not to retain truth for himself, but rather attempts to bestow these riches upon his fellows, for that is the realization of truth. The will of the absolute God is always benefits, never destroys. The purpose of the true believer is always to act, but never to coerce. Lao's teaching of non-resistance and the distinction which he made between action and coercion became later perverted into the beliefs of seeing, doing, and thinking nothing. But Lao never taught such error, albeit his presentation of non-resistance has been a factor in the further development of the Pacific predilections of Chinese peoples. But the popular Taoism of 20th century Urantia has very little in common with the lofty sentiments of the cosmic conceptions of the old philosopher who taught the truth as he perceived it, which was that faith in the absolute God is the source of the divine energy, which will remake the world and by which man ascends to spiritual union with Tao, the eternal deity and creator absolute of the universe. Confucius was a younger contemporary Lao in 6th century China. Confucius based his doctrines upon the better moral traditions of the long history of the yellow race, and he was also somewhat influenced by the lingering traditions of the Salem missionaries. His chief work consisted in compilation of the wise sayings of ancient philosophers. He was a rejected teacher during his lifetime, but his writings and teachings have ever since exerted a great influence in China and Japan. Confucius set a new pace for the shamans in that he put morality in the place of magic. But he built too well. He made a new fetish out of older and established a respect for ancestral conduct that is still venerated by the Chinese at this time of this writing. The Confucian preachment of morality was predicated on the theory that the earthly way is a distorted shadow of the heavenly way, that the true pattern of temporal civilization is the mirror reflection of the eternal order of heaven. The potential God concept in Confucianism was also completely subordinated to an emphasis placed upon the way of heaven, the pattern of the cosmos. The teachings of Lao had been lost to all but a few in the Orient, but the writings of Confucius have ever since constituted the base of mortal fabric of the culture of almost a third of Urantians. These Confucian precepts, while perpetuating the best of the past, were somewhat insumal to the very Chinese spirit of investigation that had preceded and produced those achievements which were so venerated. The influence of these doctrines were unsuccessfully combated both by the imperial efforts of Xin Wang Tai. Sorry, I'm fucking that up. And by the teachings of Mo Ti, who proclaimed a brotherhood founded not on ethical duty, but on the love of God. He sought to rekindle the ancient quest for new truth, but his teachings failed before the vigorous opposition of disciples of Confucius. Like many other spiritual and moral teachers, both Confucius and Lei Tao were eventually defiled by their followers in those spiritual dark ages of China, which intervened between the decline and perversion of Taoist faith and the coming of the Buddhist missionaries from India. During these spiritually decadent centuries, the religion of the yellow race degenerated into a pitiful theology wherein swarmed devils, dragons, and evil spirits, all betokening the returning fears of the unenlightened mortal mind. And China, once at the head of human society because of an advanced religion, then fell behind because of temporary failure to progress in the true path of the development of the God consciousness, which is indispensable to the true progress, not only of the individual mortal, but also of the intricate and complex civilizations which characterize the advance of culture and society on an evolutionary planet in time and space. Gautama Siddhartha, contemporary with Lei Tao, Lei Tse, and Confucius in China, another great teacher of truth arose in India. Gautama Siddhartha was born in the 6th century before Christ in the North Indian province of Nepal. His followers later made it appear that he was the son of a fabulously wealthy ruler, but in truth, he was the heir apparent to the throne of a petty chieftain who ruled by sufferance over a small and secluded mountain valley in the southern Himalayas. Gautama formulated those theories which grew into philosophy of Buddhism. After 6 years of the futile practice of yoga, Siddhartha made a determined but unavailing fight against the growing caste system. There was a lofty sincerity and unique unselfishness about this young prophet prince that greatly appeared to the men of those days. He detracted from the practice of seeking individual salvation through physical affliction and personal pain, and he exhorted his followers to carry his gospel to all the world. Amid the confusion and extreme cult practices of India, the saner and more moderate teachings of Gautama came as a refreshing relief. He denounced gods, priests, and their sacrifices, but he too failed to perceive the personality of the one universal. Not believing in the existence of individual human souls, Gautama, of course, made a vigilant fight against the time-honored belief in transmitigation of the soul. He made a noble effort to deliver men from fear, to make them feel at ease and at home in the great universe, but he failed to show them the pathway to the real and supernal home of ascending mortals, paradise, and to the expanding service of eternal existence. Gautama was a real prophet, and he had heeded the instruction of Hermit Godad, whatever. He might have aroused all India by the inspiration of revival of the Salem gospel of salvation by faith. Godad was descended through a family that had never lost the traditions of the Melchizedek missionaries. At Benares, however you say these fucking words, Gautama found his school, and it was during his second year that a pupil, Bao Tan, imparted to his teaching the traditions of the Salem missionaries about the Melchizedek covenant with Abraham. And while Siddhartha did not have very clear concept of the universal Father, he took an advanced stand on salvation through faith, simple belief. He so declared himself before his followers and began sending his students out in groups of 60 to proclaim to the people of India the glad tidings of free salvation, that all men, high and low, can obtain bliss of faith in righteousness and justice. Gautama's wife believed her husband's gospel and was the founder of an order of nuns. His son became his successor and greatly extended the cult. He grasped the new idea of salvation through faith, but in his later years wavered regarding the Salem gospel of divine favor through faith alone. And in his old age, his dying words were, "Work out your own salvation." When proclaimed at its best, Gautama's gospel of universal salvation, free from sacrifice, torture, ritual, and priest, was a revolutionary and amazing doctrine for its time. And it came surprisingly near to being a revival of Salem gospel. It brought successor to millions of despairing souls, and notwithstanding its grotesque perversion during later centuries, it still persists as a hope of millions of human beings. Siddhartha taught far more truth than has survived in the modern cults bearing his name. Modern Buddhism is no more than teachings of Gautama Siddhartha than is Christianity teachings of Jesus of Nazareth. The Buddhism faith. To become a Buddhist, one merely made public profession of faith by reciting the refuge. I take my refuge in the Buddha. I take my refuge in the doctrine. I take my refuge in the brotherhood. Buddhism took origin in a historic person, not in a myth. Gautama's followers called him Sasta, meaning master or teacher. While he made no superhuman claims for either himself or his teachings, his disciples early began to call him the Enlightened One, the Buddha, later on Sakyamuni Buddha. The original gospel of Gautama was based on the Four Noble Truths: the noble truths of suffering, the origins of suffering, the destruction of suffering, the way to destruction of suffering. Closely linked to the doctrine of suffering and escape therefrom was the philosophy of the Eightfold Path: right views, aspirations, speech, conduct, livelihood, effort, mindfulness, and contemplation. It was not Gautama's intention to attempt to destroy all effort, desire, and affection in the escape from suffering. Rather was his teaching designed to picture to mortal men the futility of pinning all hope and aspirations entirely on temporal goals and material objectives. It was not so much that love of one's fellows should be shunned as that the true believer should also look beyond the associations of this material world to the realities of eternal future. The moral condemnation The moral commandments of Gautama's preachment were 5 in number. You shall not kill. You shall not steal. You shall not be unchaste. You shall not lie. You shall not drink intoxicating liquors. There were several additional or secondary commandments whose observance was optional with believers. Siddhartha hardly believed in the immortality of the human personality. His philosophy only provided for a sort of functional continuity. He clearly defined what he meant to include in the doctrine of nirvana. The fact that it could theoretically be experienced during mortal existence would indicate that it was not viewed as a state of complete annihilation, and implied a condition of supreme enlightenment and supernal bliss, wherein all letters binding men to a material world had been broken. There was freedom from the desires of mortal life and deliverance from all danger of ever again experiencing incarnation. According to the original teachings of Gautama, salvation is achieved by human effort. Apart from divine help, there is no place for saving faith or prayers to superhuman powers. Gautama, in his attempt to minimize the superstitions of India, endeavored to turn men away from the blanket claims of magical salvation. And in making this effort, he left the door wide open for his successors to misinterpret his teachings and to proclaim that all human striving for obtainment is distasteful and painful. His followers overlook the fact that the highest happiness is linked with the intelligent and enthusiastic pursuit of worthy goals, and that such achievements constitute true progress in cosmic self-realization. The great truth of Siddhartha's teaching was his proclamation of a universe of absolute justice. He taught the best godless philosophy ever invented by mortal man. It was the ideal humanism and most effectively removed all grounds for superstition, magical rituals, and fear of ghosts or demons. The great weakness in the original gospel of the Buddhism was that it did not produce a religion of unselfish social service. The Buddhistic Brotherhood was for a long time not a fraternity of believers, but rather a community of student teachers. Gautama forbade their receiving money and thereby sought to prevent the growth of hierarchical tendencies. Gautama himself was highly social. Indeed, his life was much greater than his preachment. The spread of Buddhism, as I have a lot of sage going. Buddhism prospered because it of seriously, this is dyslexic craziness in my brain. And it's very highly frustrating. So I do apologize, guys. This hasn't happened in a while for me. Makes me feel ridiculously stupid. But we're going to persevere as I do with everything else. Buddhism prospered because it offered salvation through belief in the Buddha, the Enlightened One. It was more representative of the Melchizedek truths than any other religious systems to be found throughout Eastern Asia. But Buddhism did not become widespread as a religion until it was espoused in self-protection by the lower caste monarch Ashoka, who next to Akhenaten in Egypt was one of the most remarkable civil rulers between Melchizedek and Michael. Ashoka built a great Indian empire through the propaganda of his Buddhist missionaries. During a period of 25 years, he trained and sent forth more than 17,000 missionaries to the furthest frontiers of all known world. In one generation, he made Buddhism the dominant religion of one half the world. It soon became established in Tibet, Kashmir, Ceylon, Burma, Java, Simeon, Korea, China, and Japan. And generally speaking, it was a religion vastly superior to those which it supplanted or upstepped. The spread of Buddhism from its homeland in India to all of Asia is one of the thrilling stories of the spiritual devotion and missionary persistence of sincere religionists. The teachers of Gautama's gospel not only braved the perils of the overland caravan routes, but faced the dangers of the China seas as they pursued their mission over the Asiatic continent, bringing to all peoples the message of their faith. But this Buddhism was no longer the simple doctrine of Gautama. It was a miraculous gospel which made him a god, and the further Buddhism spread from its highland home in India, the more unlike the teachings of Gautama it became, and the more like the religions it supplanted it grew to be. Buddhism later on was much affected by Taoism in China, Shinto in Japan, and Christianity in Tibet. After 1,000 years in India, Buddhism simply withered and expired. It became Brahmanized and later abjectly surrendered to Islam, while throughout much of the rest of the Orient, it degenerated into a ritual which Gautama Siddhartha would never have organized. In the South, the fundamentalist stereotype of the teachings of Siddhartha persisted in Ceylon, Burma, and the Indochina Peninsula. This is the Hinayana division of Buddhism, which clings to the earliest or asocial doctrine. But even before the collapse in India, the Chinese and the North Indian groups of Gautama's followers had begun the development of the Mahayana teaching of the Great Road to salvation in contrast with the pursuits of the South. who held in to the Hinayana, or the lesser road, and these Mahayanists castes, loose from the social limitations inherent in the Buddhist doctrine, and ever since has this northern division of Buddhism continued to evolve in China and Japan. Buddhism is a living, growing religion today because it succeeds in conserving many of the highest moral values of its adherents. It promotes calmness and self-control, augments serenity and happiness, and does much to prevent sorrow and mourning. Those who believe this philosophy live better lives than many who do not. Religion in Tibet. In Tibet may be found the strangest association of the Melchizedek teachings combined with Buddhism, Hinduism, Taoism, and Christianity. When the Buddhist missionaries entered Tibet, they encountered a state of primitive savagery, very similar to that which the early Christian missionaries found among the northern tribes of Europe. These simple-minded Tibetans would not wholly give up their ancient magic and charms. Examination of the religious ceremonials of present-day Tibet rituals reveals an overgrown brotherhood of priests whose shaven heads, who practice an elaborate ritual embracing bells, chants, incense, processionals, rosaries, images, charms, pictures, holy water, gorgeous vestments, and elaborate choirs. They have rigid dogmas and crystallized creeds, mystic rites, and special fasts. Their hierarchy embraces monks, nuns, abbots, and the Grand Lama. They pray to angels, saints, Holy Mother, and the gods. They practice confessions and believe in purgatory. Their monasteries are extensive and their cathedrals magnificent. They keep up an endless repetition of sacred rituals and believe that such ceremonials bestow salvation. Prayers are fastened to a wheel, and when it's turning, they believe the petitions become efficacious. Among no other people of modern time can be found an observance of much from so many religions, and it is inevitable that such a culminative liturgy would become inordinately cumbersome and intolerably burdensome. The Tibetans have something of all the leading world religions except the simple teachings of the Jesusian gospel, sonship with God, brotherhood with man, and ever-ascending citizenship in eternal universe. Buddhist philosophy. Buddhism entered China in the first millennium after Christ, and it fitted well into the religious customs of the yellow race. In ancestor worship, they long prayed to the dead. Now they could also pray for them. Buddhism soon amalgamated with the lingering ritualistic practices of disintegrating Taoism. The new synthetic religion, with its temples of worship and definite religious ceremonial, soon became the generally accepted cult of the peoples of China, Korea, and Japan. I'm going to put a pause here. I just got a spirit download. I am probably not reading this properly because in my estimation, in my consciousness, it isn't syncing. It doesn't feel right. And therefore, whatever I'm reading, no, null and void. While in some respects it is unfortunate that Buddhism was not carried to the world until after Gautama's followers had so perverted the traditions and teachings of the cult as to make of him a divine being. Nonetheless, this myth of his human life, embellished as it was with a multitude of miracles, proved very appealing to the auditors of the northern or Mahayana gospel of Buddhism. Some of his later followers taught that Sakyamuni Buddha's spirit returned periodically to earth as a living Buddha, thus opening the way for an infinite perpetuation of Buddha images, temples, rituals, and impostor living Buddhas. Thus did the religion of the great Indian Protestant eventually find itself shackled with those very ceremonial practices and ritualistic incantations against which he had so fearlessly fought, and which he had so valiantly denounced. The great advice made in Buddhist philosophy consisted in its comprehension of the relativity of all truth. Through the mechanism of his hypothesis, Buddhists have been able to reconcile and correlate the divergencies within their own religious scriptures, as well as the differences between their own and many others. It was taught that the small truth was for little minds and the large truth for great minds. This philosophy also held that Buddha, divine nature, resided in all men, that man, through his own endeavors, could obtain to the realization of this inner divinity. And this teaching is one of the clearest presentations of the truth of the indwelling adjusters ever to be made by our Urantian religion. But a great limitation is the original gospel of Siddhartha, as it was interpreted by his followers, was that it attempted the complete liberation of the human self from all the limitations of mortal nature by the technique of isolating the self from objective reality. True cosmic self-realization results from the identification with cosmic reality and with the finite cosmos of energy, mind, and spirit, bounded by space and conditioned by time. But through the ceremonies and outward observances of Buddhism, became grossly contaminated with those of the lands to which it traveled. This degeneration was not altogether the case in the philosophical life of the great thinkers who, from time to time, embraced this system of thought and belief. Through more than 2,000 years, many of the best minds of Asia had concentrated upon the problem of ascertaining absolute truth and the truth of the absolute. The evolution of a high concept of the absolute was achieved through many channels of thought and by devious paths of reasoning. The upward ascent of this doctrine of infinity was not so clearly defined as was the evolution of the God concept in Hebrew theology. Nevertheless, there were certain broad levels which the minds of the Buddhists reached, tarried upon, and passed through on their way to the envisioning of the primal source of universe. The Gautama legend at the base of the concept was the historic fact that the life and teachings of Siddhartha, the prophet, Prince of India. This legend grew in myth as it traveled through the centuries and across the broad lands of Asia, until it surpassed the status of the idea of Gautama as the enlightened one and began to take on additional attributes. The many Buddhas, it was reasoned that if Gautama had come to the peoples of India, then in the remote past and in the remote future, the races of mankind must have been and undoubtedly would be blessed with another teacher of truth. This gave rise to the teaching that there were many Buddhas, an unlimited and infinite number, even that anyone could aspire to become one to obtain the divinity of Buddha. The absolute Buddha. By the time the number of Buddhas was approaching infinity, it became necessary for the minds of those days to reunify this unwieldy concept. Accordingly, it became to be taught that all Buddhas were but the manifestation of some higher essence, some eternal one of infinite and unqualified existence, some absolute source of all reality. From here on, the deity concept of Buddhism in its highest form becomes divorced from the human person of Gautama Siddhartha, cast off from the anthropomorphic limitations which have held it in its leash. This final conception of the Buddha, eternal, can be identified as the absolute something, even as the infinite I am. While the idea of absolute deity never found great popular favor with the peoples of Asia, it did enable the intellectuals of these lands, motherfucker. I fucking hate Zoom. Sorry for my foul language. I'm over it. I'm really, really, really over it. Over it. Let's hope that stays. I have to purge my house and my life. To unify their philosophy and to harmonize their cosmology. The concept of the Buddha absolute is at times quasi-personal, at times wholly impersonal, even an infinite creative force. Such concepts, though helpful to philosophy, are not vital to religious development. Even an anthropomorphic Yahweh is of greater religious value than an infinitely remote absolute of Buddhism or Brahmanism in their perspective. At times, the absolute was even thought of as a contained within the infinite I am. But these speculations were chill effort to the hungry multitudes who crave to hear words of promise, to hear the simple gospel of Salem, the faith in God who assured divine favor and eternal survival. I am being attacked. And I'm not giving any credence to it. It's just fucking frustrating. The God concept of Buddhism, and we're almost done. The great weakness in the cosmology of Buddhism was twofold. It contaminated, if I could break this pen, I would. Its contamination with many of the superstitions of India and China, and its sublimation of Gautama, first as the enlightened one, and then as the eternal Buddha. Just as Christianity has suffered from the absorption of much erroneous human philosophy, so does Buddhism bear its human birthmark. But the teachings of Gautama have continued to evolve during the past 2.5 millenniums. The concept of Buddha to an enlightened Buddhist is no more the human personality of Gautama than the concept of Jehovah is identical with the human demon of Hurab to an enlightened Christian. Paucity of terminology, together with the sentimental retention of olden nomenclature, is often provocative of the failure to understand the true significance of the evolution of religious concepts. Gradually, the concept of God is contrasted with the absolute, began to appear in Buddhism. Its sources are back in the early days of the differentiation of the followers of Lesser Road of the Greater Road. It was amongst the latter divisions of Buddhism that dual conception of God and the absolute finally matured. Step by step, century by century, the God concept has evolved until the teachings of I'm going to do my best here. Ryonin, Honen, Shonen, and Shiran in Japan. This concept finally came to fruit in the belief in Amida Buddha. I'm just over it today. Among these believers, it is taught that the soul, upon experiencing death, may elect to enjoy a sojourn in paradise prior to entering nirvana and the ultimate of existence. It is proclaimed that this new salvation is obtained by faith in the divine mercies and loving care of Amida, God of the paradise in the West. In their philosophy, the Amidists hold an infinite reality which is beyond all finite mortal comprehension. In their religion, they cling to faith in the all-merciful Amida, who so loves the world that he will not suffer one mortal who calls on his name in true faith and with a pure heart to fail in obtainment of the supernal happiness of paradise. The great strength of Buddhism is that it adheres its adherents are free to choose truth from all religions. Such freedom of choice has seldom characterized the Urantian faith. In this respect, the Shin sect of Japan has become one of the most progressive religions and religious groups in the world. It has revived the ancient missionary spirit of Gautama followers and has begun to send teachers to other peoples. This willingness to appropriate truth from any and all sources is indeed commendable tendency to appear among religious believers during the first half of the 20th century after Christ. Buddhism itself is undergoing a 20th century renaissance. Through contact with Christianity, the social aspects of Buddhism have been greatly enhanced. The desire to learn has been rekindled in the hearts of the monk priests of the Brotherhood, and the spread of education throughout the faith will be certainly prerogative of new advances in religious evolution. At the time of this writing, much of Asia rests in hope in Buddhism. Will this noble faith that has so valiantly carried on through the dark ages of the past once again receive the truth of expanded cosmic realities, even as the disciples of the great teacher in India once listened to his proclamation of new truth? Will this ancient faith respond once more to the invigorating stimulus of the presentation of new concepts of God and the absolute for all, which it has so long searched? All Urantia is waiting for the proclamation of the ennobling message of Michael, unencumbered by the accumulated doctrines of dogmas of 19 centuries of contact with the religions of evolutionary origin. The hour is striking for presenting to Buddhism, to Christianity, to Hinduism, even the peoples of all faiths, not the gospel about Jesus, but the living spiritual reality gospel of Jesus. Holy fuck. Presented by Melchizedek and Nebadon. Sorry, guys. As we could see, I'm very highly frustrated and under attack. Can't talk, can't read. My brain doesn't work. Hi, but I persevered through it. As annoying as my camera kept doing this. Sorry, and my sage is like literally like burnt to shreds. I hope you got something out of that because my brain sure didn't want anything out of that. Just over it. Kind of over it today. And I'm going to be over it. I hope all of you have a fantastic rest of your day. I will be live tomorrow for Friday Night Live. I don't know what time yet. Hopefully I'm better by then and my brain starts functioning properly. Just a rough day overall. And I need to probably go ground and get myself back to best. Sending each and every one of you love, light, compassion, grace, shielding, and protective energy. Please go within, be the shoulder, be the lighthouse, seed your truths, light the path forward, persevere through these very rough and difficult energies. And I hope to see you on the next one. Bye for now.